He shuffled through the door like he didn't belong there. Gray hair, thin and wispy, shoulders curved from decades of carrying invisible weight. The young volunteer at the registration table barely looked up, just slid a name tag across the table, without reading it, without caring. The old man's weathered fingers trembled slightly as he wrote his name in careful block letters. Harold Mitchell. Service dates, 1968, 1971. The volunteer was already looking past him to the next person in line, someone younger, someone who looked the part. Harold found a seat in the back row. Always the back row these days. Made it easier to leave early if the arthritis in his knees started acting up. Made it easier to pretend he wasn't disappointed when people looked right through him. The Veterans of Foreign Wars annual dinner was supposed to be different, supposed to be where old soldiers came, to remember, to be remembered. But as Harold watched the room fill with men decades younger than him, their chests heavy with pins and patches, their voices loud with stories that seemed to grow bigger each year, he felt smaller than ever. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, a Vietnam veteran himself, but from the later years, the years when the war was on television every night, when protesters filled the streets, when coming home meant something different than it did for the men who came before. He introduced the evening's honored guests, local politicians who'd never held a rifle, business leaders who'd donated to veteran causes, men who'd served in Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each introduction met with respectful applause, each name carrying weight in this room full of warriors. But Harold noticed something. The further back in time the service, the quieter the applause. Korea got polite clapping, World War II got respectful silence. And the early Vietnam guys, the ones who'd been there when it was still called a conflict instead of a war, when the world still thought it might end quickly, they got overlooked entirely, just like tonight, just like always. A younger veteran, maybe 50, turned around from the row in front of Harold. "First time here, Pops." The word stung more than it should have. Pops. Like he was somebody's grandfather who'd wandered into the wrong meeting. Harold nodded, didn't trust his voice to stay steady. "Well, don't expect too much. These things are more about networking than war stories these days." The man turned back around, dismissed Harold with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never learned that disrespect could cut deeper than shrapnel. Harold's name tag felt heavy on his shirt. 3 years in Vietnam. 3 years when most Americans couldn't find it on a map. 3 years when the evening news spent 30 seconds on Southeast Asia between weather and sports. 3 years that had carved themselves into his soul with the precision of a combat knife, but somehow left no mark that anyone else could see. He'd been 19 when he'd first set foot in that green hell. 19 and certain he was going to save the world. 22 when he'd come home to a country that had moved on without him. The dinner progressed with military precision. Course after course, speech after speech. Stories of heroism that sounded familiar because he'd lived variations of them. But when Harold tried to join conversations during the break, voices would drift away from him. Eyes would find something more interesting across the room. He was a ghost at his own reunion. A man whose service had been so early, so forgotten, that it might as well have never happened. But they had no idea who they were ignoring. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed because of your age, hit that like button and stay with me. Because what this room was about to discover would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet man in the back row. The thing about being forgotten is that it teaches you to watch. Harold had spent 50 years watching younger veterans get the recognition he'd never received. Watching the war he'd fought get reduced to a footnote in history books that spent more pages on the protests than the battles. Watching America try to forget that Vietnam had started long before the draft cards burned and the body counts made headline news. He'd watched, and he'd learned, and he'd kept his mouth shut, because that's what his generation did. They carried their burdens in silence. What Harold hadn't told anyone, what his simple name tag couldn't capture, was that he'd been there at the beginning, when Vietnam was still a place most Americans had never heard of, when the advisors were called trainers. and the combat operations were called assistance, when the government still believed it could be handled quietly, without the American people ever needing to know how deep their country was wading into someone else's war. Harold had been part of the Military Assistance Advisory Group, the men who'd gone to Vietnam in 1962, when there were fewer than 10,000 American servicemen in the entire country. They'd been told they were going to help train the South Vietnamese army. Nobody had mentioned they'd be leading combat missions. Nobody had mentioned they'd be fighting a war that wouldn't be called a war for another 3 years. Nobody had mentioned they'd come home to a country that wouldn't acknowledge what they'd done for another decade. While other men could point to famous battles, to operations that made the history books, Harold's service existed in the classified margins. In reports that were stamped top secret and filed away where historians wouldn't find them for 50 years, he'd been at Firebase Alpha when it had been overrun in 1963. He'd held the line with a handful of American advisors and 2 companies of South Vietnamese troops against 3 battalions of Viet Cong. He'd called in artillery on his own position when it looked like they might be overrun. The action had saved the base and earned him a silver star that he'd received in a ceremony so secret that even his parents hadn't been told about it until years later. But tonight, in this room full of veterans, Harold was just another old man, taking up space. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years fighting for a country that had spent 50 years trying to forget he'd ever been there. And now he was surrounded by men who'd fought the same war, in the same country, against the same enemy, and they looked at him like he didn't belong. The master of ceremonies was introducing another speaker, a congressman who'd served 2 tours in Iraq. Harold had stopped listening to the introductions. They all blended together after a while. Young men who'd gone to wars that America had been proud of, at least at the beginning. Wars that had been fought with the support of the American people, with yellow ribbon magnets and care packages and homecoming parades. Wars that had been fought in the open, with embedded journalists and live television coverage and public support. Harold had never gotten a homecoming parade, had never gotten a yellow ribbon, had gotten spit on at the San Francisco airport by protesters who'd assumed he was just another baby killer coming back from Vietnam. They hadn't known he'd been fighting that war since before most of them had heard of it, hadn't known he'd been trying to prevent the very escalation they were protesting, hadn't cared about the distinction between fighting to win and fighting to contain, between being sent to end a conflict and being sent to manage one. What happened next would make every person in that room question everything they thought they knew about service, about sacrifice, and about the men who'd carried America's burdens in silence for half a century. The congressman was talking about the brotherhood of veterans, about how service created bonds that transcended politics, transcended generations, transcended everything except the shared experience of wearing the uniform. Harold almost smiled at that. Brotherhood. He'd believed in that once. Had counted on it when he'd come home from his war to find that his war hadn't ended, had just gotten bigger and louder and more complicated. Had counted on it when he'd applied for jobs and watched employers' faces change when they saw Vietnam on his resume. Had counted on it when he'd tried to join veteran organizations in the 70s and been told that his kind of service was too controversial, too political, too much of a reminder of America's mistakes. But brotherhood, Harold had learned, was conditional. It depended on fighting the right war at the right time in the right way. It depended on coming home to the right kind of welcome. It depended on having the right kind of story to tell, the kind that made people proud instead of uncomfortable. And Harold's story, the story of America's first steps into Vietnam, the story of fighting a secret war for a classified cause, wasn't the kind of story that inspired pride. It was the kind of story that raised questions people didn't want to ask. A woman at a table near the front stood up during the applause for the congressman. She was younger than Harold, maybe early 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd served herself or lived with someone who had. She raised her hand to get the master of ceremonies' attention. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the applause. "I'd like to say something if I may." The master of ceremonies looked uncertain. This wasn't part of the program, but the woman didn't wait for permission. She was already walking toward the microphone, her steps purposeful, her face determined. Harold recognized the look. He'd seen it on the faces of soldiers who'd made a decision that would change everything. The room fell quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when people sense something important is about to happen. "My name is Margaret Chen," the woman said, her voice steady as she reached the microphone. "My husband served 3 tours in Vietnam. He came home in 1969 and spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he'd seen there. He died 5 years ago, and before he passed, he told me stories he'd never told anyone else. Stories about the men who'd been there before him, the men who'd been there when it was still supposed to be secret." Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. Margaret Chen was looking directly at him now, across a room full of veterans who were starting to turn and follow her gaze. "He told me about a group of advisors who'd held Firebase Alpha against impossible odds in 1963. He told me about a sergeant who'd called artillery on his own position to save his men. He told me that man had received the Silver Star in a ceremony, so classified that most people never knew it happened." The room was completely silent now. Harold could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the place settling on him. Margaret Chen was still talking, but her words seemed to come from very far away. "He told me that man's name was Harold Mitchell, and he told me that if I ever met him, I should make sure he knew that the men who came after him, the men who fought the war that everyone remembers, they knew they were following in the footsteps of giants." Harold tried to stand up, tried to wave her off, tried to stop this before it went any further. But his legs wouldn't cooperate, and his voice wouldn't come, and Margaret Chen was still talking. "Harold Mitchell," she repeated, her voice carrying across the room like a battle cry. "The man sitting in the back row who's been ignored all evening. The man whose service predates most of ours. The man who was fighting in Vietnam when most Americans thought it was a country, not a war." And then something extraordinary happened. A man at the front table, a Vietnam veteran with ribbons covering half his chest, stood up. He turned around, found Harold in the back row, and snapped to attention. A moment later, another man stood. Then another. Then entire tables were rising. Men and women who'd served in every conflict from Vietnam to Afghanistan, all of them standing, all of them facing the back of the room where Harold sat with tears streaming down his face. They were standing for him. After 50 years of being invisible, after 50 years of having his service dismissed and forgotten and classified away, a room full of veterans was standing at attention for Harold Mitchell. The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping, but it built like thunder, like artillery, like the sound of helicopters coming to extract you from a hot landing zone. It built until the whole room was on its feet, until the walls were shaking with the sound of recognition, until Harold thought his heart might burst from the weight of finally being seen. Margaret Chen stepped back from the microphone, but she didn't sit down. She kept standing, kept looking at Harold, kept clapping. And as the applause continued, as it grew and sustained and refused to die down, Harold understood something he'd been too hurt to see before. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about Firebase Alpha or the Silver Star or the classified missions that history had forgotten. This was about all of them. All the forgotten veterans, all the early war guys, all the men and women whose service had happened before the cameras and the protests and the public attention. The master of ceremonies had to call for quiet 3 times before the applause finally died down. When it did, when the room finally settled and people began to take their seats, Harold found that he could stand after all. His legs were shaky, his voice was gone, but he could stand. And as he stood there in the back row, as he looked out over a room full of veterans who were still looking at him with something like reverence, he realized that this was what he'd been waiting for his whole life. Not fame, not glory, not even recognition, really. Just this. Just being seen. Just having his service acknowledged by the people who understood what service meant. A young Marine couldn't have been more than 30, broke ranks from his table and walked to the back of the room. He stopped in front of Harold, came to attention, and saluted. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that Harold hadn't heard in decades. "Thank you for going first." Going first. Harold had never thought of it that way. But the Marine was right. He had gone first. He'd gone to Vietnam when it was still a secret, when America was still trying to handle things quietly, when the men being sent over there were expected to work miracles without anyone back home ever knowing they'd been there. He'd gone first, and he'd done his job, and he'd come home to silence. But the silence was broken now. As Harold finally found his voice, as he thanked the young Marine and shook his hand, as he looked out over a room full of veterans who were still on their feet, still applauding, still acknowledging his service after 50 years of waiting, Harold understood that some things were worth the wait. Some recognition, when it finally came, was worth all the years of being invisible. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and stories and men who wanted to buy Harold drinks and hear about Firebase Alpha. Men who'd fought the same war but had never known about the men who'd gone before them. Men who'd been drafted into a conflict that Harold had volunteered for when it was still being fought by fewer Americans than currently worked at a single military base. Men who'd carried the burden of an unpopular war without knowing that others had been carrying that burden longer, quieter, with even less recognition. As the evening wound down, as the last stories were told and the last hands were shaken, Harold found himself back at the registration table. The young volunteer was still there, cleaning up name tags and leftover programs. She looked up as Harold approached, and her face changed when she saw him. Word had gotten around. Everyone in the building knew who he was now. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice different than it had been hours earlier. Respectful now, aware. "I want to apologize for earlier. I didn't know. I should have been more respectful." Harold smiled at her, the first genuine smile he'd smiled in years. "You couldn't have known," he told her. "It was classified for 50 years. But that's not your fault. That's just how it was back then." He paused, looked around the nearly empty room where he'd finally, after 5 decades, been acknowledged for his service. "The important thing is that now you do know. Now everyone knows. And maybe that's enough." As Harold walked out into the cool night air, as he made his way slowly to his car in the parking lot where other veterans were still talking in small groups, still processing what they'd witnessed, he thought about Margaret Chen's husband, the man who'd served 3 tours and never forgotten the advisors who'd come before him, the man who'd carried Harold's story for years, waiting for the right moment to tell it. Harold wished he could thank him, but some debts could only be paid forward. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet Harold had been living with for 50 years. This was the quiet of satisfaction, of completion, of finally being able to rest. He'd spent half a century waiting for someone to acknowledge that he'd been there, that he'd served, that his war had mattered even when it was too secret to talk about. Tonight, finally, that acknowledgement had come. Not from politicians or historians or the American people who'd never known his story, but from the people whose opinion mattered most. From other veterans, from the brotherhood he'd thought had forgotten him. Harold pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a moment. Tomorrow he would call his daughter and tell her about tonight. Tomorrow he would finally show her the silver star he'd kept hidden in a shoebox for 50 years. Tomorrow he would start talking about Firebase Alpha and the classified missions and the war that America had tried to fight in secret. But tonight, he would just sit in the quiet satisfaction of finally being seen. In the distance, he could hear the sound of jets from the nearby airbase, young pilots training for conflicts that Harold couldn't imagine, carrying on a tradition of service that stretched back through him to his father's generation and beyond. The sound was comforting, a reminder that the mission continued, that new generations were stepping up to carry burdens that they might not be thanked for until they were old and gray and sitting in the back row themselves. Harold smiled in the darkness of his car, thinking about the young Marine who'd thanked him for going first. Going first. Maybe that was enough of an epitaph for any soldier. Maybe that was all any of them could ask for in the end. To go first, to do their duty, and to trust that someday, somehow, someone would remember that they'd been there. If this story moved you, if you believe our veterans deserve recognition regardless of when they served, Leave a comment telling me about an elder in your life who deserves more respect than they get. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who've been sitting quietly in the back row, waiting 50 years for someone to notice they were there.